The first time Marcella Bell heard the name Elijah Keller, it was spoken like a warning. She had arrived in Copper Creek, Colorado Territory, on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1874, her trunk half empty and her heart considerably lighter than it had been back in St. Louis. She had sold the dress shop she had inherited from her mother, packed what mattered, and boarded a westward train with the kind of quiet determination that people mistake for bravery, when really it is closer to desperation with good posture. She was 26 years old, recently free from a 3-year engagement to a man who had turned out to be considerably less than he had advertised himself to be, and she had decided that if she was going to build a life from nothing, she might as well build it somewhere with a sky worth looking at. Copper Creek was a mining town that had seen better years. The silver veins that had drawn men by the hundreds were narrowing, and the streets that had once thundered with commerce now held a kind of strained quiet, like a man holding his breath waiting for news. There was a general store, a saloon, 2 competing churches, a livery stable, a telegraph office, and a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Hadley, who wore her gray hair like a crown and her opinions like armor. It was Mrs. Hadley who said it first. Marcella had been sitting in the small parlor of the boarding house, nursing a cup of coffee that was more ambition than flavor, when she asked about the land she had purchased sight unseen through a land agent back in Missouri. She had bought 40 acres up on the eastern slope of Sentinel Mountain, intending to start a small herb farm and medicinal garden. She had studied plants and their healing properties for years alongside her mother, who had supplied half of St. Louis with remedies before the consumption took her. The land had seemed on paper like promise. Mrs. Hadley had set down her teacup with a particular kind of deliberateness. "That land borders Elijah Keller's property," she said. "Is that a problem?" Marcella asked. "That depends on your definition of a problem," Mrs. Hadley replied. "Elijah Keller has lived up on that mountain for going on 7 years now. Came down from somewhere up north, nobody knows exactly where. He does not come into town except for supplies, and he does not speak more than 10 words at a time when he does. He keeps wolves, or at least something that looks like wolves. He doctors animals that other men would shoot. The Henderson's bull broke a leg last fall, and every man in town said to put it down, but Keller somehow set the bone and saved the creature. People think it is unnatural." "Saving a bull?" Marcella asked. "The way he did it, quiet as a prayer," they said, like he spoke to it. Marcella looked out the window at the mountain rising against the sky, its peak still carrying the white weight of a winter that had not quite finished leaving. "He sounds unusual," she said carefully. "He sounds uncivilized," Mrs. Hadley said, with the finality of someone who had made up her mind long ago and saw no reason to revisit the decision. "He does not attend church. He does not attend the town socials. Reverend Aldous went up the mountain once to invite him personally to a prayer meeting, and Keller sent him back with a jar of honey and a polite but firm refusal. Reverend Aldous did not appreciate the honey." "Most people would," Marcella said. Mrs. Hadley gave her a long look. "Most people in Copper Creek would tell you to stay away from that mountain man. He is strange, Miss Bell, strange in ways that make decent folk uneasy." Marcella finished her coffee. It tasted like something boiled out of determination and longing. "I appreciate the warning," she said pleasantly. "Now, could you point me toward someone with a wagon? I need to get my trunk up to my land before the week is out." She slept in the boarding house that first night listening to the mountain breathe through her window, and she thought about a man who kept wolves and saved bulls and sent preachers home with honey. And she thought that perhaps Mrs. Hadley's definition of uncivilized was considerably narrower than her own. She hired a wagon driver named Pete Alcott, a man of perhaps 50 with a sun-cracked face and the kind of permanent squint that comes from too many years reading the horizon. He was agreeable enough to load her trunk and a collection of seed packets, basic tools, and a small cast-iron stove that had cost her more than she wanted to think about. But he went quiet once they turned off the main road and began the climb up Sentinel Mountain. "You know who your neighbor is up here?" He asked halfway up without looking at her. "I have been informed," Marcella said, "and you are not bothered. Should I be?" Pete was quiet for a moment, the horses picking their careful way along the switchback trail. "I do not know the man poorly," he said finally, which Marcella understood to be the most generous thing anyone in Copper Creek had said about Elijah Keller thus far. "He is odd, but I have not heard of him doing harm to anyone, just keeps to himself. Has a way with creatures that I have never seen matched." "What kind of way?" she asked. "The Henderson bull," Pete said. "I was there. That bull was in agony, bellowing fit to bring down the sky, and Keller came in and he just got low and slow and started talking to that animal real quiet, and within 10 minutes that bull had gone calm as a pond on a still day. Let Keller work on his leg without a fight. That is not a thing I can explain with anything I know." The cabin she had purchased was a single-room structure with a stone chimney and a south-facing window that let in light like a gift. It needed work. The roof had a soft patch over the eastern corner that would need replacing before the summer storms arrived, and the front step had rotted through, and the well pump required persuasion. But the land itself was extraordinary. The slope was gentle enough for cultivation, the soil dark and rich with decades of pine needle mulch, and the whole 40 acres smelled like cedar and something green and alive underneath the cold. Pete unloaded her things and accepted payment, and the apple she had saved from her lunch, and he touched his hat brim and left her standing in front of her new life with everything she owned and exactly 0 regrets, which surprised her, truthfully. She had expected at least one. She spent 3 days making the cabin livable. She patched the roof with pine pitch and spare shingles she found in the small outbuilding behind the cabin. She replaced the front step with a broad flat stone she dragged up from the creek that ran along the northern edge of her property. She coaxed the pump into working with a combination of vinegar and patience. She planted her first seed packets in a small kitchen garden plot she cleared by hand, turning the soil until her shoulders ached in a way that felt productive rather than punishing. On the 4th day, she met him. She had been following the creek upstream, looking for the flat-leaf plantain that her mother had always said grew near moving water in the mountains, when she heard a sound that stopped her completely. It was a low, pained sound, animal and wordless, coming from somewhere in the tree line on the far bank. She crossed the creek on a row of stepping stones and pushed through the willows and found him. Elijah Keller was kneeling in a small clearing, bent over a young mule deer doe that had her left foreleg tangled badly in a length of rusted wire that must have been left from some old fence line. The doe was trembling violently, her dark eyes showing white at the edges, a wound on her leg seeping where the wire had cut into the skin. The man had one hand flat against the animal's flank, and he was speaking in a voice so low and steady that Marcella could not make out the words, only the tone, which was like water over smooth stone. He was larger than she had expected, not tall in a showy way but broad and solid, with dark hair that curled at the collar and a beard that was thick but not unkempt. His hands, she noticed immediately, were extraordinarily careful. He moved the wire in increments, pausing whenever the deer flinched, speaking the whole time. He did not notice her for almost a full minute. When he did look up, his eyes were the color of good whiskey held to the light, amber with gold running through it, and they went from sharp surprise to a kind of measuring steadiness almost immediately. He did not startle. He did not stand. He just looked at her the way a man looks at something he needs to understand before he can decide how to proceed. "Stay still," he said. His voice was quiet but carried completely in the mountain air. Marcella stayed still. He went back to the wire. She watched him work it free, and she watched the doe the whole time too, watched the animals breathing slow by degrees as the man's voice continued its low, steady cadence. When the wire finally came loose, Keller held it and moved back by inches, and the doe stayed down for a long moment, legs tucked beneath her, and then rose unsteadily and stood, testing the injured leg. She looked at Keller for what seemed like several seconds. Then she walked into the trees. He straightened. He was tall after all, she realized. The kneeling had hidden it. She will need to keep it clean, Marcella said. The wound, it was not deep but wire cuts infect easily. He looked at her. You know animals. I know wounds, she said, and I know yarrow grows along this bank. It would help with the bleeding if you had gotten to her earlier, but the tincture would still help if she comes back. He was quiet for a moment. You are the woman who bought the Hadley land, he said. It was not a question. Marcella Bell, she said. She did not offer her hand because the creek was between them and he still held a length of rusted wire, but she stood straight and met his eyes. Elijah Keller, he said. Your neighbor. I know who you are, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. I imagine you do, he said. What did they tell you? That you are uncivilized. He looked at the trees where the deer had disappeared. I suppose that depends, he said, on what you are trying to civilize. She thought that was one of the more interesting things anyone had said to her in recent memory. He crossed the creek, stepping the stones with the automatic ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Up close, she could see that his shirt was plain dark wool, his trousers canvas, his boots well worn but cared for. He smelled like pine and wood smoke and something herbal she could not immediately identify. His face was weathered in the way of men who spend their hours outdoors, not harshly but warmly, like good leather. How long have you been here? He asked. He was looking at her not with the frank boldness some men showed, which always felt like a kind of trespass, but with a direct attention that felt more like being genuinely seen. 4 days, she said. The roof on the east corner needs work, he said. I patched it. His eyebrows moved slightly. With what? Pine pitch and shingles from the outbuilding. He was quiet a moment. That will hold through summer, he said, but it will need proper shingles before the first hard snow or you will have trouble. I know, she said. I intend to do it properly before October. He nodded, as if this answered something he had been wondering about. Then he coiled the wire and tucked it under his arm. I am going to lay some yarrow along the deer path, he said, in case she comes back to water. If you have any to spare from your bank, I would be grateful. Marcella looked at the creek bank where the flat-leaved plantain she had been searching for grew in abundance alongside the yarrow she had not yet noticed. I will bring some up to your property line, she said. Where is it? The big split pine, he said, nodding north along the creek. 1/2 a mile up, she nodded. He walked away and she watched him go, and she thought about the way his hands had moved on that deer's flank, the infinite patience of it, the complete absence of carelessness. She brought the yarrow that afternoon. He was not at the property line, but there was a flat rock there she had not noticed before, and on it was a small clay jar with a folded piece of paper tucked under it. She opened the jar and smelled something complex and green, something that reminded her of her mother's apothecary cabinet. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was clean and careful. It read, Calendula and elderflower salve, for the wire cut on your palm. I noticed when you crossed the creek. She looked at her right palm. There was indeed a small cut there, which she had not noticed making, probably on one of the stepping stones. She had not noticed it because it had not been bothering her. She had not noticed him noticing it either. She used the salve. It was extraordinary. Better than anything she had compounded herself, and she had been studying plant medicine for 15 years. She left the yarrow on the rock with a note of her own. Thank you for the salve. The yarrow is fresh from the south bank. Your deer came back to the water an hour ago. The leg looks better than expected. She did not sign it. She figured the handwriting would be identification enough. The following morning there was a small basket at her front step. Inside it was a pound of dried venison, a jar of wild honey, and a folded piece of paper. I am glad about the deer. The honey is from the hive behind my cabin. It is good in coffee if you have coffee. If you need anything on the property looked at, knock at my door. It is the cabin with the green door 1/2 a mile through the pines north. He had signed it with just his initial. She stood on her new front step holding the basket, and she felt something stir in her chest that she did not immediately name. She had spent 3 years attached to a man who had never once noticed a cut on her hand. She thought perhaps the warning about Elijah Keller had been delivered by people who did not know the difference between solitude and savagery. The weeks that settled into spring were busy with the work of establishing herself on the land. She turned soil and planted her medicinal garden: echinacea, valerian, chamomile, lavender, St. John's wort, comfrey, and a dozen other species she had propagated from seeds and cuttings brought from Missouri. The garden took shape row by row, and she built small wooden markers for each plant in the hand-lettered style her mother had taught her, and she felt more purposeful than she had in years. She did not see Elijah Keller directly for 9 days after the creek meeting, but she felt his presence in small ways. The loose board on her fence line was fixed one morning without her asking, a neat job with square-headed nails she did not own. A pile of properly split firewood appeared at the edge of her property closest to his. When a stray dog began coming around her chicken run, it stopped after 2 days, and she found a note on the flat rock by the split pine that said simply, "He has been redirected. He answers to Moses. He is friendly if you are inclined." She laughed out loud at that note, standing alone on the mountain in the morning light, and the laugh surprised her with how full it was. She went to Copper Creek on a Thursday to collect supplies and found herself the subject of considerable curiosity. People were polite but watchful. A woman named Clara Dunmore, who ran the millinery, asked very directly how she was finding the mountain. "Beautiful," Marcella said honestly. "Remarkable soil. The light is extraordinary in the mornings." "And your neighbor?" Clara asked. "Has he bothered you?" "He has been nothing but considerate," Marcella said. Clara blinked as though this did not compute. "Keller, Elijah Keller. He left firewood and fixed a fence board," Marcella said, "and the honey he keeps is remarkable." The look on Clara Dunmore's face was one Marcella would think about later with some amusement. It was the look of a person whose map of the world had just been quietly, firmly corrected. She bought her supplies, including the proper cedar shingles for the east roof corner, and was loading them into Pete Alcott's borrowed wagon when a man appeared at her elbow. He was perhaps 40, broad in the shoulders, with a marshal's badge pinned to his coat and the kind of smile that knew it was being charming. "You must be the new woman up on the mountain," he said. "Marshal Roy Deaver, welcome to Copper Creek." "Thank you," Marcella said. "Marcella Bell." "I heard you bought the Hadley land," he said. He helped her lift the shingles without asking if she wanted help, which was either manners or presumption, and she could not yet tell which. "That is not easy country for a woman alone." "I am managing," she said. "Still," he said, "if you need anything, any trouble at all, I am here, particularly if your neighbor gives you any difficulty." "He has not," she said. Deaver's smile stayed in place, but something behind his eyes shifted. "Keller is an odd one," he said. "He has got some strange notions. Does not register his land properly, does not pay the new district fee that went through last fall. I have been meaning to have a conversation with him about civic responsibilities." Marcella looked at him steadily. "I am sure that is an important conversation," she said, in a tone that did not offer any particular opinion about whether she thought so. She drove back up the mountain thinking about the marshal's badge and the smile that had been too quick, and the way he had said Keller's name with the particular flatness of someone who has decided something already. She knocked on the green door 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, when the mountain was bright, and the aspens were coming into their full spring green, and she had a genuine reason to visit because she had found a hawk with a broken wing in the meadow below her south field, and she did not know enough about birds to know whether the break was treatable. He opened the door before she finished knocking, which suggested he had heard her coming through the pines. He was in shirt-sleeves, which for some reason she had not expected, as though she had imagined he lived permanently dressed for weather. He was holding a tin cup of coffee, and he looked at the bundle of her coat folded over her arm, in which the hawk was wrapped to keep its wings still. "Come in," he said, stepping back. She had not known what to expect from his cabin. Mrs. Hadley's descriptions had conjured something dark and animal-smelling, rough and unfinished in the way of a man who did not value comfort. What she stepped into instead was a single large room that was extraordinarily tidy, not in a sterile way but in the way of a man who knew where every tool belonged and put it there. The walls were lined with rough-hewn shelves, and the shelves were full. Books, dozens of them, leaned in uneven rows. Jars of dried herbs and compounds she recognized, and some she did not. Tools hung on pegs. A workbench along the far wall held what appeared to be the careful anatomical drawings of animals, done in pencil on brown paper with a precision that made her stop and look. He had a fireplace and a small table and 2 chairs and a narrow bed in the far corner, with a quilt she could see had been mended many times with great care. There was no wasted space. Everything was present for a reason. On the hearth, watching her with enormous gold eyes, was a large dog that was not entirely a dog. "That is not entirely a dog," she said. "No," he agreed. "That is Josephine. She is 3/4 wolf. She will not bother you unless you bother the hawk." Josephine's ears rotated in Marcella's direction, but she did not move from the hearth. Elijah set his coffee down and came to her and folded back the coat with hands that were unhurried and precise, looking at the hawk without touching it yet. "Red-tailed hawk," he said. "Female. How long ago?" "I found her this morning," Marcella said. "She was on the ground in the south meadow. She did not fly when I approached." "That is a bad sign or a good one," he said. He crouched and brought his face level with the bird, studying it. "If she was dead still, she would be too far gone. But she tried to bite you." He said it as a statement, and Marcella looked at the shallow marks on her right thumb. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. He touched the wing with 2 fingers, moving along the bone so slowly that Marcella held her own breath in sympathy. The hawk mantled and hissed. He did not flinch. He spoke to it, that same low cadence she remembered from the deer, and the hawk's feathers gradually settled. "Secondary covert fracture," he said. "It is clean. I have seen worse heal completely." He looked up at her. "I will need to splint it. It will need to stay still for 6 weeks at minimum. Do you want to stay?" She did. She sat in one of his chairs and watched him work for an hour. He built a small splint from thin wood and wrapped the wing with strips of clean cloth soaked in something that smelled medicinal. He moved with the economy of someone who had done this many times, and the hawk, impossibly, went quiet under his hands. He spoke to it occasionally in a voice that required no translation, because it was simply the sound of reassurance stripped to its essential frequency. "Where did you learn this?" she asked. "My father's people," he said, without looking up. "My mother was Scots-Irish. My father was Cree from the north. He was the one who taught me to read land and animals the way other men read books." She absorbed this. "And the books?" She nodded at the shelves. "My mother," he said, a pause. "She believed you could learn anything if you had the right book and enough time." "What happened to them?" she asked. It was a forward question, and she knew it, but something about the cabin and the hawk and the quality of his attention made forward questions feel honest rather than intrusive. He was quiet for a moment, but it was a thinking quiet, not a closed one. "My father died when I was 15, he said. "Fever." "My mother lived another 12 years after that in their cabin in the Northern Territories. She died the winter before I came south." Another pause. "I came south because I wanted different mountains." "Do you miss them?" He looked at her then. "Every day," he said simply. "But the missing is not a wound anymore. It is more like a river. It is part of how the land feels." She had never heard grief described that way. She thought about her mother, about the particular shape of that loss, and thought that if she could find words for it, she might choose those same words. She had not expected to feel understood in Elijah Keller's cabin, by a man the town had decided was beyond understanding. "I had better explain something," she said. "The marshal in town, Deaver, he said something about land fees. He seemed to have a particular interest in your property." His expression did not change dramatically, but something around his eyes sharpened. "Deaver has been trying to push me off this land for 3 years, he said. "He wants the timber rights to the upper forest. He found a backer in Denver who would pay well for them." "Can he force you off?" "He has been manufacturing reasons," Elijah said. "The land fee he mentioned was created specifically to burden small holders who could not easily reach the district office in Canyon Falls to pay. It is a 60-mile round trip. I made it last November and paid it and have the receipt." He carefully tied the final wrap on the hawk's wing. He is persistent. But he has not found a way yet that holds up to scrutiny. You should be careful, she said. He looked at her steadily. I am, he said, but thank you. She stayed longer than she had planned. He made her coffee, which was extraordinary, better than anything she had tasted in Mrs. Hadley's boarding house or on the entire westward journey. And she said so. And he told her he roasted the beans himself over a slow fire until they were exactly the color of mahogany, and that most people burned them and called it strong. She told him about her medicinal garden, and he listened with complete attention, asking questions that revealed a knowledge of plant medicine that matched and in some areas exceeded her own. When she described her chamomile variety, he went to his shelves and produced a seed packet she did not recognize. This is a mountain strain, he said, setting it on the table between them. My mother cultivated it. It is stronger than the lowland variety. You may have it if you want to try it. She took it. She looked at his handwriting on the label, that same clean, careful script she recognized from the notes on the flat rock, and she held the packet in both hands for a moment. You are nothing like what they told me you were, she said. He sat across from her, both hands around his coffee cup, and he looked at her with those amber eyes that held the light the way good glass does. What did they tell you I was? He said. Uncivilized, she said. Strange, someone to avoid. And what do you think? He asked. She considered. I think you are the most careful person I have met in recent memory, she said. And I think the things you choose to care about make people who do not care about those things uncomfortable. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You are a remarkable woman, Marcella Bell. It was the plainest compliment she had ever received, and it landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings outward in every direction. She went home with the mountain chamomile seeds, and the memory of his coffee, and the sound of his voice when he spoke to frightened animals, and she stood in her garden at dusk, and planted the seeds in the last of the light, and she thought that she had come to Colorado territory looking for good soil, and she had found something considerably more interesting. June arrived with long days and genuine warmth, and Marcella's garden grew at a pace that gratified her enormously. The echinacea put out bold purple heads, the valerian rose tall and ferny, the calendula blazed in the south beds, and Elijah's mountain chamomile, once it took hold, proved even more vigorous than he had promised. She began drying and preparing her first small batches of remedies, working in the evening by lamplight with the door open to the mountain air, and she felt her mother's hands in hers every time she measured and blended. Elijah came by twice in June, both times with a stated reason. The first time he came to check the hawk, which had been moved to a roomy cage he had built for it against her south wall where it could watch the meadow. The second time he came because he had noticed from his own property that the well pump casing had cracked, a problem she had not yet discovered, and he brought the tools to fix it without being asked. She made him lunch both times. Simple things, bread and dried meat and pickles she had put up from the small patch of cucumbers she had planted near the back fence, and he ate with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, as if the food itself deserved to be noticed. They talked easily. This was the thing that struck her most. She had imagined that a man who chose solitude would be difficult in conversation, full of silences that pressed rather than breathed. But Elijah Keller was the opposite. He was quiet in the way of a man who had learned to listen first and speak second, and when he did speak it was worth waiting for. He told her about the mountain seasons, about the elk migration in October that turned the high meadows into a moving river of antlers, about the way the creek flooded every third spring when the snowpack was heavy. She told him about her life in St. Louis, about the dress shop and her mother, and the engagement she had ended. He was not a bad man, she said, of the man in St. Louis, and she found she could say it without the old complicated ache. It was simply a man who had a picture of a wife in his head and wanted me to stand in that picture's place, and I kept being myself instead, which was not what he had ordered. Elijah looked at her across the small table. Being yourself seems like the most sensible thing I can imagine, he said. Most people prefer a woman who is a little less, she said. Then most people are making a significant error, he said, and he said it so matter-of-factly that it did not even feel like flattery. It felt like a statement of observed fact from a man who dealt in observed facts. She felt the warmth of it for 3 days after he left. In the second week of July, Trouble arrived wearing a suit and a land deed. His name was Gerard Payne, and he came up the mountain road in a hired buggy with a briefcase that he carried like a weapon. He was from Denver, mid-40s, well-fed, with a legal associate trailing him, and a letter of authority from the district land management office. He presented himself at Marcella's cabin first, perhaps because her property was more accessible from the main trail. He was unfailingly polite, which was the kind of politeness that is actually its own form of threat. He explained that a land survey conducted the previous autumn had determined that the property line between the parcel she had purchased and the parcel occupied by one Elijah Keller had been incorrectly drawn in the original 1867 registration. He placed a map on her kitchen table and indicated, with a carefully groomed finger, that approximately 8 acres of what she believed was her land was actually in dispute. This would appear to give your neighbor a claim to a portion of what you purchased, Payne said. Given the uncertainty, the district office is prepared to adjudicate. However, there is also a school fee delinquency on record for the Keller property that, combined with the disputed acres, may result in the whole of that section being made available for other interests. Marcella looked at the map. She looked at the legal associate who was writing things in a small notebook and not making eye contact. She looked at Payne's patient smile. "What school fee?" she asked. "There is no school on this mountain." "The fee supports schools in the district generally," Payne said smoothly. "It is levied on all registered properties over 30 acres. When was it established?" she asked. "Last September," he said. "And what is the process for contesting an incorrectly drawn property line?" she asked. A pause. The patient's smile held. "That would require a formal survey filed with the office in Canyon Falls. It is a lengthy process. Often the matter is resolved more efficiently through negotiation." She thanked him for coming. She did not offer him coffee. She watched the buggy go back down the trail, and then she put on her walking boots and walked through the pines to the split pine and kept walking to the green door. Elijah was in his work area behind the cabin, tending to a splinted fox kit that was healing from a trap injury. He looked up when he heard her coming, and he read her expression immediately. "Payne," he said. "You know him," she said. "He came here 4 months ago," Elijah said. "That was the first approach. Deaver is working with him. Payne has connections to the Denver Timber Consortium. They want the upper forest on my north section." He set the fox kit gently into its recovery box and stood. "What did he say to you?" she told him. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains above them. "He is using your property as additional leverage," he said. "If he can create doubt about both our boundaries, he muddies the water enough to give Deaver grounds to get involved as the local authority." "That is a crooked plan," Marcella said. "It is," he agreed, "but it is the kind of crooked that is hard to prove in the moment." "What do you need?" she asked. He looked at her. "I beg your pardon. To fight it," she said. "What do you need?" He seemed, for just a moment, slightly undone by the question. As though he had been so long accustomed to fighting things alone that the offer of an ally from outside his own resources required a recalibration. "I have my original land deed," he said, "and the payment receipt for the district fee. What I do not have is a relationship with anyone in Canyon Falls who would push a new survey through quickly. These things can take months unless someone with standing applies proper pressure." "What about the town doctor?" she asked. "Or the judge?" "Copper Creek Circuit Judge is sympathetic to mining and land interests," he said. "The doctor is a good man, but he has no legal authority." He paused. "There is a woman in Canyon Falls named Hester Pratt. She is a land law advocate, one of very few women in the territory doing that work. She helped a family outside of Leadville fight off a similar claim 2 years ago. but I do not know her, and I do not have anyone to introduce us." Marcella was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My former land agent in St. Louis has a cousin in Canyon Falls who is a lawyer. His name is William Sutter. He once wrote to me after the sale went through to say that if I ever needed any assistance in the territory I should contact him." She looked at Elijah. "I was not sure whether that was a professional courtesy or a social one. I am going to take it as the former." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression was very still and very warm at the same time, the way a candle flame is still at its center and warm at every edge. "You do not have to involve yourself in this," he said. "I am already involved," she said. "He put a disputed boundary on my kitchen table. And besides that, you fixed my fence and my pump, and you gave me mountain chamomile seeds that are the finest plants in my garden, and you left salve for a cut on my hand that you noticed before I did." She held his gaze. "I am involved." The warmth in his expression expanded, quietly, the way dawn does without announcing itself. "All right," he said. She wrote to William Sutter that afternoon and paid Pete Alcott's oldest son, a quick 17-year-old named Thomas, to ride the letter to the Canyon Falls post office the following morning. While they waited, she and Elijah settled into a pattern that had its own logic and its own rhythm, as natural as the mountain's own. She came to the flat rock by the split pine most mornings and left whatever she had extra from her garden, and he left things there in return: remedies, tools he had mended, a jar of rendered beeswax that made her leather gloves last twice as long. They shared meals 2 or 3 times a week, alternating between her cabin and his, and the conversation never ran thin. He taught her things. He taught her to read the mountains, whether in the color of the morning sky, in the behavior of the ravens that nested on the north face. He taught her which plants around the property had properties she had not known: a small mountain dock that was better for fever than anything in her garden, a lichen that his father's people had used for infections that she found, upon careful preparation, to be genuinely remarkable. He showed her how to track the deer that moved through the south meadow, not to hunt them, but simply to understand their patterns, to know when the land was healthy by the regularity of their movement. She taught him things too. She showed him how to prepare a compound for respiratory illness that was more effective than the simple infusions he had been making, how to extend the shelf life of his remedies with proper drying and storage techniques, how to identify the 4 chamomile varieties and use them differently. She lent him books from her own small collection, and he lent her his, and they discussed what they read in the evenings with a passion and specificity that would have probably alarmed anyone in Copper Creek, but felt, between them, like exactly the right way to spend an evening. She noticed things about him constantly. The way he never killed insects that came into his cabin but moved them outside with whatever was handy. The way he always knew where Josephine was, not by watching her constantly, but by some peripheral awareness that was entirely unconscious. The way he held a book, carefully but not preciously, like something he trusted and respected in equal measure. The way he looked at her sometimes when she was speaking, and she knew he was not just hearing the words but everything around them. She did not name what she was feeling. She was careful about that, because she had named things prematurely before and regretted it. She let it accumulate without labeling it, the way you let a garden grow before you harvest it. William Sutter's reply came 3 weeks after she sent her letter. It was longer and more useful than she had hoped. He knew Hester Pratt. He knew her well. He would send an introduction by separate post, and he believed she would take the case if the documentation was solid. He also included a reference to a specific section of the Colorado Territory Property Act that directly addressed the process for contesting boundary surveys less than 10 years old, which, given that Elijah's land had been registered in 1867, placed it exactly within the contestable range. She carried the letter through the pines on a Thursday morning, and she knocked at the green door and gave it to Elijah, who read it at his kitchen table with the serious attention he gave all texts, and then he looked up at her. "This is excellent," he said. He looked down at the letter again. This section he cites. I know a case in Wyoming that used similar grounds. You know land law, she said. I have had reason to study it, he said dryly. They wrote back to Sutter together, at his kitchen table, with his hand occasionally steadying the paper and hers moving across it with the pen. Their hands were close several times. Neither of them moved them apart. Hester Pratt came to Copper Creek in early August, and she was exactly the kind of woman who restores your faith in the possibility of righteous effectiveness. She was 50, spare and sharp-eyed, with silver hair pinned with total efficiency, and a briefcase that actually held authority rather than just suggesting it. She met with Marcella and Elijah at Marcella's cabin, examined both their land deeds, the disputed survey map, Elijah's fee receipts, and the correspondence from Payne's Denver office, and she made the kind of steadily ticking sounds of a person who is building something in her head. The survey was conducted by a firm with existing contracts with the Denver Timber Consortium, she said. That alone is enough to challenge it. I can file for an independent survey with the territorial office in 2 weeks if you can provide me with a sworn statement from any local party who was present when either property was first settled. Pete Alcott's father, Elijah said immediately. He was here when I bought the land. He witnessed the original deed signing. Get me his statement, Hester Pratt said, and I will need your original deed, Mr. Keller, the physical document, not a copy. He went to his cabin and came back with it in 10 minutes. It was stored in a metal document box under his bed, she later learned, the same place his mother's letters lived. He handed it to Hester Pratt and she looked at it and then looked at him with a very dry expression. Mr. Keller, she said, this document is entirely in order. This property is yours without question. They are trying to manufacture doubt about a question that has no doubt. I know, he said. But manufactured doubt in the hands of a sympathetic authority can take on its own weight. Not if we move faster than they do, she said. She did, old Mr. Alcott, who was 81 and sharp as a tack and deeply unimpressed by anyone in a suit from Denver, gave his sworn statement in 45 minutes and signed it with a hand that did not shake. Hester Pratt filed the challenge with the territorial office in Canyon Falls by the end of August. Deaver made one more attempt to pressure Elijah directly, appearing at the bottom of the mountain trail on a hot afternoon in late August with his badge and his flat professional smile, and a very strongly worded letter about delinquent civic responsibilities. Elijah stood on the trail with his arms folded and said, calmly and without any particular heat, that he had Hester Pratt's card and that the marshal was welcome to discuss the matter with her. He said it with such complete and unruffled certainty that Deaver left without saying much more, and Marcella, who had been watching from behind the split pine with her arms folded and her chin up, felt something fierce and proud bloom in her chest. She stepped out from behind the pine after Deaver had gone. You were watching, he said. I was, she said without apology. He looked at her. The afternoon light was doing something spectacular to the aspens, turning them into moving gold, and it was doing something similar to his expression, she thought. Something was very near the surface in him. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming in the pressure of the air. Marcella, he said. Yes, she said. I would like to be honest with you, he said. I would prefer that, she said. He was quiet for a moment, but it was not the quiet of uncertainty. It was the quiet of a man who chooses his words the way he chooses everything, with care. I have lived on this mountain alone for 7 years, he said. I chose solitude because I found most company shallow or difficult in ways that cost more than they returned. I have not wanted to change that. A pause. Until you came up the mountain road with your trunk and your cast-iron stove and your opinion about Mrs. Hadley's coffee and your absolutely extraordinary ability to notice what needs noticing. She felt the ring spreading in her chest again, wide and warm. Go on, she said. I have been falling in love with you since you stood on the other side of that creek and told me to look for yarrow on the bank, he said. He said it plainly, the same way he had said everything, with full honesty and zero theatrical artifice, and it was somehow more devastating for that. I am aware that you have come here to build something of your own, and that the last thing you may want is a complication of the variety I am describing. I am also aware that I am not what the town considers an acceptable prospect. But I would rather tell you honestly than let the feeling sit unexpressed, because I have never found silences comfortable when there was something real that should be said. Marcella Bell stood in the aspen golden light on Sentinel Mountain and looked at this man who read animals and kept wolves and saved deer from rusted wire and sent preachers home with honey, and noticed cuts on her hands before she noticed them herself. And she thought about how long she had been looking for someone who treated living things with the care they deserved. "Elijah," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have been falling in love with you since you left salve on a rock for a cut I did not even know I had," she said. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps. He took her face in both his hands, those extraordinary careful hands, and he looked at her for a long moment, close enough that she could see the amber and the gold in his eyes separately. And then he kissed her with the same quality of attention he gave everything, completely and without reservation. And it was the best kiss of her life by a considerable margin. Josephine found them standing in the aspens 20 minutes later, still talking, his arm around her shoulders and her head turned toward him, and the wolf dog sat down 10 feet away and watched them with what Marcella would later describe as deeply satisfied patience. September brought the land disputes resolution, which arrived not with drama but with paperwork, which is how most victories present themselves. The territorial office upheld Elijah's deed. The independent survey confirmed the original boundary. Gerard Payne's brief was dismissed. Roy Deaver received a formal censure from the Canyon Falls District Authority, which was not the full consequence he deserved, but was enough to strip him of any further official leverage against the mountain properties. He remained the town marshal through the fall, but he did not come up Sentinel Mountain again. Hester Pratt sent a final letter noting that she was delighted by the outcome and that she hoped Marcella and her neighbor enjoyed many years of undisturbed land, and that perhaps they would see fit to plant something in her honor, to which Marcella replied that they had named the entire chamomile bed after her. The hawk was released in the 3rd week of September. They did it together, both of them standing in the south meadow in the early morning, Elijah holding the cage's latch and Marcella standing a step back. The hawk turned on the edge of the cage opening, looked at Elijah with a long, amber-eyed regard that felt like recognition, and then launched into the air with a sound like a sail catching wind, and she rose in a long, effortless spiral over the meadow and the pines and was, within minutes, a distant circling point against the blue. Elijah watched until she was gone. Marcella watched him watch, and she saw the uncomplicated joy in his face, the kind of joy that belongs only to people who love something without ownership. "She will stay in the territory," he said. "Red tails do not go far from where they recovered. Will she come back?" "Sometimes," he said. He looked at Marcella. "Are you all right?" "I am extremely well," she said. She took his hand. It was a habit she had developed over the previous weeks, taking his hand the way you reach for something that belongs in your grip, easily and without forethought. He closed his fingers around hers. October arrived with the elk migration, exactly as he had promised, and they watched it together from the high meadow above his cabin, sitting on a fallen log in the early morning, while the mountain shook with the movement of animals and the air rang with the sound of them. It was one of the most extraordinary things she had ever witnessed. Hundreds of elk moving through the aspens in the gold October light, their breath misting in the cold air, the enormous bulls with their impossible racks of antler moving among the cows with the authority of small mountains. She had her hand in the crook of his arm and her head was on his shoulder, and she thought, "This is what I came west for. Not specifically this. Not precisely this man and this mountain and this morning, but something like it. Something that made the world feel the size it actually is." "I want to stay," she said. He turned his head. "You are planning to leave." I mean, I want to stay permanently, she said. Not just for a season or until I have saved enough to go somewhere else. I want this to be the place. It already is, he said. For me it has been for 7 years. It is for me too, she said. I knew it when I planted the chamomile. He pressed his lips to her temple. It was a tender and unhurried gesture, and it did not need to be anything more than what it was. She repaired the east roof corner properly in mid-October, and he helped without being asked, because he was that kind of person. They worked on it together in the cold, clear air, replacing the shingles row by row, and she noticed that he made sure she had the harder sections and he took the precarious ones without making it look deliberate. She let him without making it look like she was letting him, and they finished the roof in a day and stood back and looked at it in the last light. It will hold, he said. I know it will, she said. We built it. He smiled at her. It was a full smile, the kind she had learned he gave only when something genuinely earned it, and it changed his face from handsome to something considerably more disarming. November brought the first snow and the beginning of what Marcella privately thought of as the interior season. She had expected isolation to press on her when the mountain closed in, the way it sometimes did in her boarding house days in St. Louis, a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with whether other people are present. Instead, she found that the winter mountain was simply a different country with different rules, and that there was enough inside her own cabin to keep her mind alive through the darkest months. She and Elijah settled into a winter rhythm. He came to her cabin or she went to his, most days of the week, the walk through the snow-covered pines becoming as familiar as any road she had ever walked. They cooked together and read together and argued pleasantly about botany and weather and the finer points of honey varieties, and they kissed in the firelight the way people kiss when they have decided on each other completely. Josephine had, by November, stopped waiting to be invited and simply appeared at Marcella's cabin door some mornings, sitting with the patient dignity of a creature who knows exactly how welcome she is. Marcella began leaving a scrap of meat out for her on the step, and Josephine accepted it without losing any of her dignity. And after the 3rd week she came inside when the door was open and lay on the hearth rug and watched everything with her gold eyes. And Marcella felt that this was the wolf dog's particular form of endorsement. Moses, the stray dog, who had been redirected in early spring, turned out to have simply relocated himself to the boundary of both properties and belonged to no one and everyone. He was brown and shaggy and entirely without guile, and he attached himself to Marcella with the faithfulness of a creature that knows when it has found a good situation. Elijah gave him his name and basic training, and she gave him the kitchen scraps and the warm spot by the stove, and he repaid both of them with the complete and uncomplicated devotion of a good dog. She asked him on an evening in December, the snow coming down outside in large, slow flakes and the fire burning and Josephine asleep on the hearth and Moses asleep against her feet. She asked him about his father's people. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him decide how to answer. He did not have an instinct toward simplicity on complex subjects, which she had come to love about him. He gave things the weight they required. My father left his people when he married my mother, he said, not because they rejected her but because she needed to be near her own family. There was grief in that for him that he carried quietly. He never spoke badly of it. He said the land does not belong to people. People belong to the land, and the land is everywhere, so there is no real leaving. He paused. I have thought about that my whole life. I think he was right, and I think there is also a grief in it that being right does not dissolve. The injustice of it, she said, of what happened to his people is happening still. He looked at her. Yes, he said, there is no way to speak of it that does justice to it. I will not pretend there is. I carry his blood and my mother's, and I live on land that has a history I did not make but that I am part of. I try to live on it the way he taught me, as a member of the land, not an owner of it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his palm up and held her hand. He would have liked you, Elijah said. My father. He always said the best people are the ones who pay attention. She was crying slightly, which surprised her, and she did not look away or pretend she was not. "I am paying attention," she said. "I know," he said. He asked her to marry him on a morning in January, which was not when she expected it, but then Elijah Keller did almost nothing when she expected it. He asked her in his cabin on a Tuesday morning, between coffee and the start of the day's work, with Josephine on the hearth and snow on the windows and a matter-of-factness that was entirely his own. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if you are willing, not because I think you require it or because I am concerned about proprieties. Because I want to spend my life with you, and I would like there to be a ceremony that says so, because I think things that are true deserve to be said aloud." She loved him enormously in that moment, which she had been doing for months, but which sometimes made itself newly felt in waves. "Yes," she said, "on both counts." They married in March, when the snow was beginning to pull back from the south-facing slopes and the first green was pushing through the exposed soil, because she wanted to be married with the mountain waking up around her. They did not marry in either of Copper Creek's two churches, which caused some comment. They married in the meadow above her cabin, with Reverend Aldous presiding, because for all his disappointment about the honey refusal, he was fundamentally a decent man, and he came when asked. Pete Alcott and his wife attended. Hester Pratt made the journey from Canyon Falls. Clara Dunmore from the millinery came, along with 3 other women from town who had, over the months, come up the mountain out of curiosity and left with a more nuanced understanding of both Marcella and Elijah than they had arrived with. Old Mr. Alcott came in a wagon and sat in a chair they carried out for him and declared the whole thing extremely satisfactory. Moses sat beside Marcella's skirt during the ceremony, which was not planned. Josephine attended from a respectful distance, as was her custom. The ceremony was brief and genuine. Reverend Aldous read what he read, and they said what needed to be said. And when Elijah put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band he had ordered from Canyon Falls, she looked at his face, and he was looking at her with that warm, complete attention, and she thought that this was the clearest version of being loved she had ever felt. Afterward, they had a meal laid out on long plank tables in the meadow, and people talked and ate, and the mountain was extraordinary above them. And she stood at one point with Hester Pratt drinking cold water from tin cups and looking at the man she had married where he stood talking to old Mr. Alcott. "He is remarkable," Hester Pratt said. "He is," Marcella agreed. "Most remarkable of all is that he has never tried to be," Hester said. "That is the rarest kind." Marcella looked at her. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." Spring and summer of 1875 were the fullest months Marcella Bell, now Marcella Keller, had ever known. Her medicinal garden expanded beyond the original beds and took over the south slope in a way that looked, from above, like a patchwork quilt of different greens and golds and purples. She began selling her remedies in Copper Creek, first through Clara Dunmore's shop and later through a small arrangement with the town doctor, a practical man named Frederick Parrish, who was more interested in results than theories and who, after trying her respiratory compound on himself during a bad chest cold in May, became something of an enthusiast. Elijah's reputation underwent a quiet renovation over that year. It had not needed it, in Marcella's view, but she observed it with interest. The Henderson family began bringing their animals to him regularly, after the bull's recovery became a well-established local legend. A family called the Warrens brought a mule that had been shot with a fragment that no one in town could remove safely, and Elijah removed it in an hour with a calmness that Dr. Parrish watched with undisguised interest. A woman named Helen Brooks brought a dog that everyone said should be put down after a snake bite, and Elijah kept it in his cabin for 2 weeks and sent it home healthy. People came to the mountain now. Not in crowds, but steadily, with animals and questions and things that needed careful handling. Elijah answered them all with the same unvarying care, unhurried and honest about what he could and could not do. He never accepted payment in money from those who clearly did not have it, and he never turned anyone away. He turned down Reverend Aldis's invitation to the church twice more, and Reverend Aldis began leaving small but sincere acknowledgments of this pattern of behavior in his Sunday sermons, which was as close to an apology as the man's nature allowed. Marcella was present for all of it. She helped with the complicated cases, and she learned from him and he from her, and the combination of what they each knew was, as Dr. Parrish observed one afternoon in August with some admiration, better than anything he had been trained in at medical school in Philadelphia. "You two should write it down," he said. They looked at each other. "We have been considering it," Elijah said. They had been considering it since March. They had been keeping notes in matching journals that they compared in the evenings, building what was becoming a comprehensive guide to the plant medicine and animal care practices they had developed together, a document that drew from his father's Cree knowledge and her mother's apothecary tradition and their own years of combined observation. It was careful work and it would take time, and she found it the most meaningful thing she had ever undertaken. She was also, by October of 1875, carrying their first child. She told him on a morning of extraordinary stillness, the kind of morning that comes once or twice in October when the air is so clear and cold it seems to have edges, and the mountain was a thing of such complete beauty that even she, who had grown accustomed to it, stopped and stood in the yard for several minutes simply looking. She told him in his cabin, over coffee, with Josephine on the hearth and the first fire of the season burning well. She said it plainly because she had learned from him that plain was usually the right register for things of magnitude. He was still for a moment, his hands around the coffee cup, his eyes on her face. And then something happened in his expression that she had no word for and did not need one, because it was entirely itself, a kind of opening, like a door going wide in a room that had always had good light but had never been fully let into the day. He came around the table and he held her with the same care he held everything, careful and complete, and she felt his breath against her hair, and she put her hands on his back and they stayed like that for a while, with the fire burning and the mountain outside and Josephine watching from the hearth with the benevolent gravity of a very old soul. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "A great deal," he said. "And happier than I have words for." "Good," she said. "That is exactly the right answer." They named their son James, after Elijah's father, whose name had been Jamesquitin in his own language, which meant still water, which seemed to Marcella exactly right for a man she had never met but felt she knew through his son. James Keller was born in the late spring of 1876, in the cabin on Sentinel Mountain, with the windows open and the meadow in full bloom below, and he arrived with the kind of robust certainty that suggested he had been waiting with impatience. Dr. Parrish was present and competent, and afterward he sat in Elijah's chair with a cup of coffee that Elijah had pressed on him with the particular insistence that characterizes new fathers who need to do something with their hands, and he said that he had attended many births, and that this had been one of the better experiences, because the mother had been, in his professional opinion, extremely well prepared and extremely calm. Marcella, holding her son, looked up from the baby's face long enough to say, "I have been preparing plant compounds for labor support for the last 4 months, Dr. Parrish." "It showed," he said, with genuine admiration. Elijah sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at their son with the expression she had come to think of as his fullest expression, the one she saw when the elk came through the high meadow, or when a recovered animal went back into the wild, or when she said something in conversation that surprised him into delight. It was the expression of a man who is completely present in a moment that deserves complete presence. "Hello, James," he said quietly to the baby. And the baby, with the imprecise focus of the very newborn, seemed to orient toward the sound of his father's voice. Josephine, who had been sitting outside the cabin door for 7 hours with the patience of geology, was admitted when Dr. Parrish left, and she came in and regarded the baby with enormous amber eyes, and then lay down on the floor beside the bed with the air of someone who has accepted a new responsibility and takes it seriously. Moses, outside, barked once. Elijah went to the door and said, "Enough," and Moses was quiet and lay down on the step. The summer James was born was the warmest anyone in Copper Creek could remember, and the mountain was so abundantly itself that Marcella found herself walking the property with the baby strapped against her chest, in a carrier Elijah had made from soft leather and canvas, showing James the garden and the creek and the split pine, and the place where the deer came to water. James watched everything with enormous dark eyes that were going to be his father's color, and he seemed, at 6 weeks old, already paying attention. They finished the first volume of their plant and animal medicine guide in the fall of 1876. Dr. Parrish read it over 3 evenings and returned it with 13 pages of enthusiastic annotations and a formal inquiry about whether they would be willing to have it reproduced by a printer in Canyon Falls for distribution to other practitioners in the territory. They agreed, and 50 copies were printed in January of 1877, and within 6 months, Dr. Parrish had received letters of inquiry from practitioners as far as Santa Fe and Cheyenne. Copper Creek had, by 1877, made a comprehensive peace with its mountain neighbors. Clara Dunmore brought her sick cat to Elijah without embarrassment. The Hendersons referred everyone they knew to both Elijah and Marcella as a matter of course. Even Reverend Aldous, who had replaced the honey in his pantry with honey from Elijah's hive because it was genuinely exceptional, acknowledged from the pulpit one Sunday that the Lord worked in ways that occasionally required revision of initial assessments, which was as close to a retraction as anyone had ever heard him make. Roy Deaver left Copper Creek in the spring of 1877 to take a position elsewhere, which everyone agreed was appropriate for different reasons. No one missed him with any particular intensity. Life on Sentinel Mountain settled into a richness that was not the richness of ease but the richness of depth, of days that were full of real things that required real attention and returned real satisfaction. James walked at 10 months and talked at 14, a torrent of observations about everything he encountered, and he was interested in plants and animals with a totality that his parents found both familiar and delightful. By the time he was 2, he followed Elijah through the property with the focused dedication of a small scientist, asking the name of everything. Elijah told him everything he asked, with the same patience and care he gave to all questions from any creature. He taught James his father's Cree words alongside the English ones, so that the boy grew up knowing the mountain in 2 registers, and Marcella added the botanical Latin for the plants, and James absorbed all 3 languages with the flexible ease of a mind that had never been told language had limits. Marcella was also continuing to be herself, which was something she had made a commitment to early and did not revise. She expanded her operation in Copper Creek, formally arranging a regular supply agreement with Dr. Parrish's practice, and also with a new general store that had replaced the old one with a more forward-thinking proprietor. She was consulted by women in the town about women's health matters that they would never bring to a male physician, and she handled these consultations with the care and discretion they deserved. She was not a doctor by training, and she said so honestly, but she was knowledgeable, and she was thorough, and she treated every person who came to her with the dignity of complete attention. She taught James about her mother's work the way Elijah taught him about his father's. They built their son's world from 4 people who were no longer living: a Cree man who had said that people belonged to the land, a Scots-Irish woman who believed you could learn anything with the right book, an Irish-American woman who had turned plant knowledge into a healing practice, and a father Marcella had never known, who had left her his determination and his eyes. James grew up understanding that he came from all of this, and that being a person is largely the act of assembling who you are from the people you come from. The hawk Marcella had named privately, in her head, as first came back to the South Meadow in the spring of 1877. She was certain it was the same bird by the particular reddish flush on the tail, and because she flew low over the cabin once before ascending, which seemed interpretive if you were the sort of person who found meaning in such things, and Marcella was exactly that sort of person. She remembered, she told Elijah. Of course she did, he said. Their second child, a daughter, was born in the summer of 1878, on a night when lightning walked across the high peaks, and the mountain smelled like ozone and sage, and the particular electricity of a storm that was impressive but not dangerous. They named her Ruth, after Marcella's mother, and she arrived in the world with considerably less patience than James had shown, and considerably more volume, which turned out to be a reliable predictor of her subsequent character. Ruth was loud and laughing, and absolutely without fear from the moment she could move, and James, who was 2 years old and deeply serious about his new responsibilities, took to his sister with the gravity of someone who understands they have been entrusted with something important. He explained everything to her, constantly, at length, and Ruth listened with the furious attention of a child who intends to use all available information as quickly as possible. Josephine accepted Ruth with the same dignified endorsement she had given James. She was old now, moving more slowly in the cold, and she slept more deeply, but she was present at the cabin most days, and she had appointed herself guardian of both children with an authority that Moses recognized and respected. Moses was gray-muzzled and entirely gentle, and James had at some point taught him to sit, stay, and offer a paw, which Elijah regarded with benevolent amusement. Marcella watched her husband with their children and felt something she did not always have an immediate word for, a deep-settled warmth that was different from happiness, which she had always found to be a temporary state, and more like what she imagined the bed of a river feels, bearing weight and moving water and still being itself underneath all of it. She was not entirely happy every day. Some days the work was harder than her body liked, and some days the isolation pressed on her in the way it sometimes did, and some days James cried about something she could not fix, and some days the land gave more problems than gifts. But she was rooted. She was in the right place. She was known by someone who saw all of her and chose all of her, and she saw and chose all of him, and that was an entirely different category of experience from anything she had known before. In the autumn of 1878, Elijah took James up to the high meadow for the elk migration for the first time. James was 2.5 and had been told about it for 6 months, and had been vibrating with anticipation for 3. Elijah carried him on his shoulders for the climb, and then they sat together on the fallen log where Elijah and Marcella had sat 4 years before, and Marcella came too, with Ruth in the carrier and a blanket against the cold, and the 4 of them sat in the mountain mourning while the elk came through the aspens. James was completely silent for the first time in his young life. He watched with enormous eyes, and his small hands gripped his father's hair without pulling it, and when the great bulls moved past below them, close enough to feel the ground shake slightly under their hooves, he turned and looked at his father and then back at the elk and then at his father again, as if he needed to confirm that this was real. "They come every year," James whispered. "Every year," Elijah said. "And they know the way." "They always know the way," Elijah said. "That is something worth remembering." James looked at the elk for a long time. "I am going to remember this," he said, with the solemn certainty of a child who means it completely. Marcella, with Ruth sleeping warm against her chest, put her hand on her husband's arm, and he covered it with his. And the mountain did what it had always done, which was to continue being exactly what it was, indifferent and magnificent and theirs. Josephine died in the winter of 1879, on a January night that was cold and bright and still, in her place on the hearth rug in Elijah's cabin, which had become their cabin over the years in every practical sense, even though they kept both buildings for different purposes. She died in the way of old animals who have decided to go, quietly and with complete dignity, and Elijah sat with her through the night, and in the morning he buried her on the ridge above the cabin where she had liked to sit on clear days and look at the distance. Marcella stood beside him at the small grave in the frozen morning, and she held his hand, and she did not say anything because he did not need her to. She felt the grief in him, clean and deep, and she let it be there. She had learned from him that the way to honor grief is to let it stand as tall as it is. Moses lived for 2 more years, to a very old age for a dog, and when he went easily, on the front step in the sunshine, in the summer of 1881. James, who was 5, sat beside him for a long time that afternoon, and he told Moses carefully and at length what a good dog he had been, and then he helped his father dig a grave near the garden where Moses had always liked to lie in the afternoons. It was the first experience of death James had that he could fully comprehend, and Elijah and Marcella handled it with the honesty and the care that they brought to all hard things. He was a good dog, Elijah told James. The best, James said. Yes, Elijah said. And the things that are best stay with you, even when you cannot see them anymore. James was quiet for a moment, thinking about this the way he thought about everything his father told him, fully and without rush. Like your father, he said. Elijah looked at his son. Exactly like my father, he said. The Guide to Plant and Animal Medicine had by 1881 gone to 3 printings and reached practitioners as far as California. Dr. Parrish was corresponding with an agricultural college in Ohio that was interested in incorporating its plant medicine sections into their curriculum. Marcella and Elijah had added 2 more volumes worth of material and were working on a 3rd, and the work had become one of the central pleasures of their life together. The long evenings of writing and argument and discovery that were also always the pleasure of being alongside each other. They brought a new dog into the house in the spring of 1881. A year-old border collie mix that Ruth named immediately and imperiously before anyone else could, declaring her name to be Vera, and Vera turned out to be the most aggressively intelligent dog either of them had ever encountered, a classification Elijah made with some feeling given his years of experience. Vera herded everything. She herded the chickens, which was useful. She herded James and Ruth, which was arguable. She attempted to herd the deer that came to the South Meadow water, which Elijah observed with complicated feelings. She learned to leave the deer alone, eventually, when Elijah asked it of her in his particular way, and she accepted this limitation with the long-suffering air of a professional who has been asked to constrain her gifts. In the summer of 1882, Marcella stood in her garden in the early morning, which was still her best hour, the hour when the light came from the east through the pines and turned everything to gold and shadow, and she looked at what 15 years of living had built into this soil and this slope. The garden was extraordinary, full and complex, the different greens and textures and heights of it, a thing her mother would have stood in front of and been unable to speak for a moment. The cabin behind her had been expanded twice and had proper curtains now, and the view from the south window was still the finest view she had ever seen. The other cabin, Elijah's, was now where they kept their work, the reference library, the medicine preparation room, the writing desk where the 4th volume was taking shape. She could hear James in the other cabin, explaining something to Ruth at considerable length. She could hear Elijah in the work shed, where he was treating a dog someone had brought from town the afternoon before. She could hear Vera somewhere in the back of the property, engaged in some project that probably involved strategic repositioning of the chickens. She was 34 years old. She was in the right place. She was known and loved completely. She heard Elijah come out of the work shed, and she heard him come through the garden without stepping on anything because he never stepped on anything, and he came to stand beside her with his coffee cup and the particular patience that was as much a part of him as his eyes and his hands. He did not say anything for a moment. They stood together and looked at the mountain and the garden and the morning. "The chamomile needs thinning," he said. "I know," she said. "I am planning to do it this afternoon." "I will help," he said. "You always help," she said. "I always intend to," he said. She leaned against him. His arm came around her, and she thought about the woman who had arrived on this mountain 8 years ago with her trunk and her cast-iron stove and her opinion about coffee and her fierce, careful heart. And she thought about everything that had grown from that arrival. Not just the garden and the guides and the practice and the reputation, but James and Ruth and Vera and the red-tailed hawk who still circled the South Meadow some mornings, and the memory of Josephine on the hearth and Moses on the step and the elk in October, and the deer that a careful man had freed from rusted wire on a spring afternoon on the bank of a creek. "Elijah," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad I came up the mountain," she said. He held her a little closer. "So am I," he said. "Every day I am glad." The morning continued around them. James's voice carried from the cabin, rising in the earnest rhythm of someone who has just discovered something important. Ruth's voice answered, skeptical and interested in equal measure. Vera appeared at the edge of the garden, assessed the situation, and apparently decided nothing required her intervention. The light moved through the aspens. The hawk lifted from the South Meadow on a rising current and went up in a long, unhurried spiral above the mountain, above the pines and the creek and the garden and the two people standing in it, above all of it. And Marcella watched her go until she was just a dark point against the blue, turning in the clean air, and then she looked up at her husband's face. He was looking at the hawk too, with that open, uncomplicated joy she had loved from the beginning, and then he looked down at her and it was the same. Exactly the same joy. The kind that does not compete with itself and does not run dry. She kissed him there in the garden, with the coffee still warm in his hand and the chamomile needing thinning and the children in the cabin and the mountain doing what mountains do. And he kissed her back with all the care and all the certainty that had always been the particular character of everything he did, and it was, she thought, exactly enough. More than enough. It was everything.